man, I can't recommend him enough. Go back and watch the interview I did with Dr. Robert Malone. Just go search on your podcast player, just search The Mark Moss Show, and you'll find the podcast with Dr. Robert Malone. We talked about the fifth generation of warfare. Basically, we talked about how warfare has changed throughout the ages. The first stage was man on man. Second stage was like organizing armies. The third stage was then like industrialized armies. This was aircraft carriers, ships, tanks, etc. Fourth generation of warfare really probably started in Vietnam, and it started with like guerrilla warfare. So little guerrilla wars would come out and attack, and they'd retreat, and they'd kind of come from everywhere. It's hard to find. That then led into like terrorism as we know it. Terrorism is like a bunch of independent cells like the Taliban or ISIS or whatever. And he points out that since we've entered the fourth generation of warfare, like I said, since Vietnam, the United States has never won a war. Pretty interesting. You've seen Biden talking about, oh, you guys with your guns, how are you going to defend against an F-16? Well, it worked out pretty good for Afghanistan. They ran America out of their country, tail tucked between their legs. We had to abandon, I think, hundreds of Americans and $8 billion of weapons we had to leave for them because we couldn't get it out. And they had pickup trucks and machine guns. So worked out pretty well for them. We haven't been able to beat that. And the reason why is because you have all these decentralized cells that aren't being controlled by one leader. There's no head to cut off, no head of a snake. All these cells work independently with a shared ideology. But anyway, now the fifth generation of warfare is one of information. It's a psychological warfare. And he talks about how in that fifth generation of warfare, you are in this war, you're under attack from everywhere all the time, but you don't know where the attack's coming from. You don't know why it's coming. And it's a war of information. It's propaganda, it's manipulation, but it's all fought over information. And so that's the battleground. That's why free speech is under attack. That's why you're constantly being pounded with misinformation and malinformation and disinformation. You're being constantly warned that you're under attack from that and that you need someone to protect you from that. And so, of course, the government should be the one to protect you from all that misinformation and malinformation. Of course, we continue to find out over and over and over and over that it's actually the government that's the one spreading the misinformation, malinformation, disinformation. We see it all the time, over and over and over. It's always the government that does it, but of course they're telling us that we can do it. Now, I talked about a little while ago, talking about this Restrict Act that's being put forth. As I said, it's probably the most dangerous, the most scary piece of legislation I've ever seen come out of the government, and that's saying a lot. The Patriot Act was probably the biggest one that we've ever seen that lost the most amount of freedom. This is the Patriot Act times 1,000, and they're using it in the guise of TikTok. All right. Like I said, I've already kind of covered it. I'm not going to go super deep into it. If you want to get a full detail of what's going on with that, check out my main YouTube channel, Mark Moss, and check that out. But I want to kind of move on past that and show you that while that is the biggest and the most scary piece of legislation we have, it's part of a bigger initiative. It's part of the bigger war. And again, this fifth generation of warfare, it's being waged on you. It's we the people versus these technocratic leaders that want to control us in some sort of, dystopian nightmare. Technologically driven dystopian nightmare. What I call the battle for the fate of humanity. That's what's being waged. And so this is happening. And we see it, and it's happening from every single angle. One, they want to control the information any way they can. Now, one is by using something like this TikTok ban. They call it that, the Restrict Act, which is basically makes it where if you use any tools that they don't deem approved, you can go to prison, for the rest of your life and lose everything, basically. But we see that it's being attacked from other angles as well. So you might remember, I've talked about extensively here, how Elon Musk released all the records, all the data, the emails, the text messages, etc., between the federal government, the Biden administration, and Twitter. And how the Biden administration, I believe maybe the FBI as well, were basically forcing Twitter to silence and take down accounts and tweets they didn't like, to push the narrative up that they wanted, to decrease the visibility of narratives they didn't want. And it's all exposed. It's called the Twitter files. Just go Google it. Of course, news channels were media blackout. They don't want you to know this. Fox is probably the only one that talked about it other than smaller channels like myself. when I say smaller like myself, I think Joe Rogan's talked about this quite a bit, and he's way bigger than any of these channels. But what's interesting about it is Elon Musk gave these files to a couple reporters that he knew would actually talk about it, that would actually push it out. Barry Weiss was one of them. Matt Taibbi was one of them. And, of course, the government didn't like that. They didn't like being exposed. And so they dragged Matt Taibbi up, Michael Schellenberger up before a committee. You have to come to the government. You need to answer for this. How dare you expose our secrets? You better come answer for that. You need to tell us who gave you the information, all these things. And of course, reporters don't give up their sources. That's not happens. And so as they're getting grilled there, as they're being, basically read the riot act for this, interesting enough, while that was happening, just, coincidentally, the IRS decides to make a strange house call to Matt Taibbi. Now, the IRS doesn't just mysteriously just show up at people's houses. And I referenced earlier in an earlier segment about how Choke Point 1.0, the original one, was the weaponization of the IRS against political enemies. But at that time, it was against it's always against conservative enemies. And at the time, it was against the Tea Party specifically. And here we have the IRS specifically targeting out a journalist because it appears that he provoked the ire of Democrats by releasing information on the Twitter records that they didn't want. It says this effort has already inspired government bullying, with Chair Lena Khan's Federal Trade Commission targeting new Twitter owner Elon Musk and demanding the company, quote, identify all journalists. So the FTC is coming after Elon Musk and Twitter. How dare you give this information? We need to see all the journalists. Like, no, that's protected under our government. The reason why that's protected is because you and I, are private citizens. Private citizens. That means our lives are to be private. The government are public servants. That means they are representing the public. They are our servants for the public. Everything they do should be known and public. We, as private citizens, should not. And so the reason why we have these laws and rules that protect journalists is so they can constantly tell us what's happening in the public sphere, so they can expose this, so we, as private citizens, can know this. But of course, they don't want that. Through the Restrict Act, they want everything they do to be private. As a matter of fact, in the Restrict Act, what they can do unilaterally with no due process is protected. It can't even be exposed in a Freedom of Information Act and a FOIA request. But here, they're demanding that they identify all this. And of course, the battle raged on. It was pretty good conversation with Matt Taibbi there. But then, like I said, now IRS just happens to show up at his house. What do you think the IRS wanted to hire 86,000 more agents for? You think it was so they could answer the phone when you call so you don't have to wait online for 3 or 4 hours? No. It was so they could build their own private army so they can go out and harass people like Matt Taibbi, potentially people like me, and probably at one point even people like you. Because in a war of information, if you can't control the information and you don't have truth on your side, then you're going to lose. And so the only thing they have is they have a monopoly on violence, and they ain't afraid to use it. If you just tune in, you're listening to The Mark Moss Show, talking about the decentralized revolution. This world's breaking apart, and we're giving you the play-by-play. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Hit me up on social media, @1MarkMoss. Let me know if you listened to it. And that's what I got. Thanks so much for listening today.